Welcome back to another episode of the Authentic Man podcast, mini episode that I do on the weekends for you wonderful human beings on topics that have come up in my coaching or come up in my own personal life or come up I just felt like talking about. So today I'm talking about the fear of not being good enough. This is something that I see in my own life, if I'm really honest, massively in my own life, but also in the men that I work with. And this can have really detrimental effects on a man's relationships, his dating life, how he shows up in his career, the goals he sets, his willingness to even try and do things. Like I've seen men who have come to me and they are completely stuck in life. They're not moving, they're not going anywhere, they're not doing anything. And they're not in relationships, they're, all sorts of things like that. They're in their relationships and constantly their fear of not good enough comes up in their relationship and it sabotages relationships or dating situations, makes them clam up, makes them stop talking, makes them stop expressing how they feel, what they want, what they desire, or maybe sexually, and they're not expressing any sort of sexual desire or what they want at all, or on so forth, or not having sex at all. And then I've had men at the other end who are highly successful, doing really, really well in their lives, and the fear of not being good enough is the thing that drives them, but it actually is also the things that causes them huge amounts of distress. The mental turmoil in between. Sometimes they use drink and drugs to soothe it, to have big blowouts, to run away from the thoughts and the feelings. And sometimes they cope with excessive amounts of exercise and stuff like that. So it can really, this fear of not being good enough, it can really, come at different levels, and it's not obvious. You might see someone who's highly successful. I actually generally think people who are highly successful, and from my experience of both, friends and also of clients and men I've worked with, is that highly successful people in general have a huge fear of not being good enough, or huge fear of failure as well. You can kind of synonymous. Here, fear of failure and fear of not being good enough are very close, but not exactly the same. So where does it come from? Like most great things, it comes from some early childhood experiences. It can come from, I've noticed, it's either dads who are very, very laid back and not involved. That's something I've seen quite a lot with men, is their dads who are just like not really involved in their life or very passive. Or it can be things like, and there's a lot of things here, right? It's parents who are extremely demanding and critical, like very, very critical. The sort of parents who are actually kind of perfectionists, who berate their child for making the smallest mistakes, even from a young age, or highly disciplined parents, military style, or I've known this from a few guys that I've worked with, and their parents are African and their dads are just like very, very strict and very, very quick to berate them for making any sort of mistakes as well. I've seen it in parents who are very quick to compare their children. And the way that their parents would motivate their children was like, why are you not doing well as Sally? Sally's doing better than you. Or, Jane is getting A's and B's. What's happening to you? And they were always comparing them to others, or even sport as well, comparing them to other kids that are around. And there's this constant feeling for them of like, other people are better than me. Yeah. Or the parents were critical, or the parents were just really down on them. Some parents are, tell their kids they're useless, and in many different ways, sometimes in very subtle ways, not putting them forward for certain things, and not telling them they're good enough. That's another thing as well, is a lack of encouragement. There's a lot of men I've worked with, and their parents didn't encourage them, didn't acknowledge them for their successes, or would, it would be like they got a B in a test and it'd be like, oh, why didn't you get an A? That sort of thing. It's very common. I see it also in people who come from really poor or disadvantaged backgrounds as well, where they often felt like they weren't as good as the other kids. So say, for instance, maybe you grew up in a council estate or the equivalent, right? And you always felt poor and you always felt disadvantaged. You would often look at other kids and see them as being better than you, more intelligent than you, and so forth. And I also think you can't run away from the kind of influence of culture, and the fact that if you've grown up as an ethnic minority in some countries, or you have been a woman, you would grow up often with this general sense through the media, through through television, through magazines, through books, that you were lesser than, that you weren't as good. You know, like I definitely feel like as a young black man growing up in the UK in the 90s, with the way that, you know, crime was often reported, especially if it was by black men, this feeling that there's something wrong, there's something bad about me, and which feeds into this feeling of not being good enough and others being better than as well. So those are a whole host of things that might be true for you. It might be slightly different. And you have to also remember, like trauma, it's the story we tell ourselves. So it's like maybe there was only a handful of times in your life where, you know, your parents and caregivers or teachers made you feel like you weren't good enough, but you really noticed those and you really paid attention to those. And then you went on and looked for more evidence of this, because that's often the thing with not being good enough. We are searching for evidence of its truth. And if it's in relationship, what comes up, I see a lot with men, is they're in relationship and they're searching for evidence that their partner is giving them signs they're not good enough, whether it is they're not good enough in bed, whether they're who they are isn't good enough, you know, they're not good at what they do. It could be a partner who criticizes you or gives you feedback. You know, men who are not often feel like they're not good enough really struggle with feedback, because it really goes to the core of who they are. So, you know, like I said, the sexual one is something I've seen a lot with men, not feeling good enough, so they don't have sex with their partners, and then their partners complain that they want to have more sex, or their partners request more sex, and then they don't feel good enough, and it kind of compounds. So it's often this compounding effect which leads them to like withdraw and avoid things, whether that's relationships, whether that's sex, whether that's dating. And I see again, you know, I keep saying this, but like dating is another place where we can easily feel not good enough, or if we have a story of not feeling good enough, we can perpetuate in dating and find all this evidence for it, right? And it can cause in dating is us actually not trying to really date the people we want to. Like maybe you see women who are really beautiful or really well educated or very interesting or lead really cool and fascinating lives, and you're like, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm not going to try and date them, I'm not going to try and talk to them, right? So that's kind of the origins of where this comes from. And this is one of the most common things I talk to men about, actually. So how does this start to manifest in your actual life? I've talked about dating, relationship. I'm going to get into kind of the thinking of it, right? Negative self-talk. This is one of the number one ways in which it occurs, right? You will basically talk to yourself like you're a piece of shit sometimes. Not always, but sometimes, often in the moments that it matters. Maybe when you've made a mistake, maybe when you start to compare yourself to somebody else, or maybe there's something you want to do or somewhere you want to go with your career or your relationship or whatever it may be, and you start to talk to yourself like you just don't deserve it. You're not good enough. You're a piece of you'll say things like, you're a piece of shit, that's never going to happen for you. You're never going to be as good as those other people. She's never going to want you. You know, women like that don't go for guys like, and you'll say it to yourself in your own head or some variant of that, right? And you'll notice that this voice in your head, and you notice what I'm saying here is self-talk, and the voice in your head can sound a bit like a parent. Like if you have parents who are really critical, it will sound like one of them. Yeah, I can put it down for myself and look at mine. It's definitely the way my father would speak to me sometimes. It's how it sounds, right? But not always. Or it'll just be because it's just this amalgamation of the messages that you've received in the past about yourself, and you've kind of internalized them and you talk to yourself about in this way. And this is a really important thing. This voice is not who you are. This voice is not a voice you necessarily have to listen to. This voice is not your conscious thoughts and decisions about yourself. It is a program. It is a type of program. It sounds so not very woo-woo, but it's like, you know, I'm down with the woo, to be honest. It's a program in the way that, you know, I used to work in software development, and you write code and you program it into the system. And you are the system, and it's been programmed into you through caregivers, through the world you live in around you, media, teachers, and so forth. And you've absorbed it. And then what does a good program do? It executes. Whenever it finds a certain level of parameters that occur in a moment, right, it executes. And this is all it is. And this is a really important distinction, because it gives you a little bit of space from like, this is who I am and this is the truth, to this is just some thoughts that I have. And I do a lot of this with my clients, like, because as simple as this concept is of these are just some thoughts, this can take years to really get into our minds and really actualize, you know, and doesn't mean you shouldn't try, because it can be life-changing. It's been life-changing for me to be able to just go, oh, look, I'm having some thoughts that are telling me that I'm not good enough to ask this guest to come on my podcast. Yeah, I have those thoughts. Really honest with you. Sometimes I will approach people to be guests on my podcast and I'm like, oh, they're going to say no because, who am I? I'm just some fucking dude from East London. Like, I'm a nobody, blah, blah, blah. And then I notice, I'm like, look, I'm having no thoughts. Cool. And I step aside from it and take the action I want to take. So the first thing is to look at the self-talk, right? And notice that as well. Notice where that's coming from, because it's really important to see that. And this another part on this kind of self-talk, and this self-talk I like to kind of call your kind of inner critic. I like to give it a different name that's not you, right? So it's just like separate from you. Is that somewhere this inner critic has fears, right? There's a fear that this inner critic has, right? And it's worth exploring that within yourself, of asking, almost doing some kind of like writing exercise, as if there's your kind of conscious self, and there's this inner critic in your head. And this inner critic, you can give it a name. You can even take some time to kind of close your eyes and be like, what would this being look like? And I say being because it could be anything from a cloud to dark smoke to some sort of animal or mythical beast. And write and be like, okay, the mythical beast, my inner critic is saying this to me. And then you respond, you ask questions, and it might sound really crazy, but I've seen some really, really incredible results for a lot of men with this. And I've done it myself a lot, because it creates some space between you and the inner critic, right? And you start to ask it questions like, what's it trying to protect you from? What's it afraid of? What's its ultimate goal? What does it really want? Like, bring some level of curiosity and compassion as well when you do this, because it's very easy to berate, and try and smash through, but that doesn't work. You're just using the same energy against this energy, and it's very powerful, because often there's some wounded part of you that this is inner critic, is some damaged, hurt, belittled part of you that's trying to come through, and it needs something. It's the kind of basis of a lot of kind of like parts work and so forth. There's like having that conversation is really important. And another part we have to do around this is often this voice will come up with kind of the worst case scenario and what we want to avoid. If I'm not good enough and I talk to that girl over there, in the bar, the worst case scenario that it's coming up with is like, she's going to reject me and everyone in the bar is going to laugh at me. That's, can be a common one. I know that because of the men I've often worked with. And we can dive into this with some work around like, okay, what is the worst case scenario? What's the likelihood of that happening? Yeah, what's the likelihood of that happening? And what would be the actual damage to my life? And I think we really be honest with you, going and talking to that girl over by the bar and saying, hi, how are you? And she rejects you and ignores you. And, people around here that she rejects you. The damage it does to your life actually is very little, really, because you could leave the bar and then you never have to see this person again. And no one in the bar you'll probably ever see again. It's very, very low, right? For those sorts of things. As long as you're not going to say anything particularly outlandish and abusive or something like that, it's very, very low. And actually to be like, what's the cost of inaction? What's the cost if I don't take action now? And what's the cost if I keep not taking action here? It's a really important one. What's the cost to me in my life if I continue to not take action in this area, in this way of my life, and see what that is. You can do this as a writing exercise because you've got all the questions. You just need to play back this podcast, right? And then just see like what's the cost of inaction. This really maps out what your life will be like if you keep not taking action in this area. And it might be for you business. It might be intimacy in your relationship. It might be your dating life. It might be around your starting a business or starting a podcast or whatever it is. But there's somewhere in your life where you can see that the fear of not good enough is continually getting in the way. Yeah, it's really, really important to see that as well. And I'm a big fan of that. So this is, you're going to uncover all this stuff. So how do you start to remedy this, right? One of my most favorite ones to do, and this practice will change your life, but you have to do it. You have to actually do it. You can't just do it once. This is something you have to do consistently over time. And I have a client of mine, and he's done this every single day for over a year. And it's been revolutionary for him. It really has. It's completely shifted how he feels about himself and his own feelings of self-worth and self-esteem. And what it is writing down your daily successes. You can get a little diary and just write down your daily successes. What went well today? What did I do well today? The big and the small, right? And just write them in a little journal and do it every day. Just do it every day. It'll make a huge difference to you. Don't just think them. You have to write them down. That's a really important part of this. Writing them down. The act of taking it out of your head and putting it onto paper makes a huge difference. And just do this every day. And the truth is, most of you, you're not going to do this because there's the same part of you that has the fear of not being good enough is sabotaging you with your levels of consistency. Yeah, this wound is also self-sabotaging you, because this practice here could take you 5 minutes a day and could change your life. And it sounds so simple, you know. You can add on if you want. You could, when you finish doing it, you can like breathe in the success, like breathe in for 5 minutes and just peak your attention on the feelings of what you created and succeeded in, right? That's an extra. But this simply writing down things goes a really, really long way. And it's what most people aren't prepared to do it. They're not prepared to have that consistency, because this is part of why, you know, where they're at with their lives is that they don't have the level of diligence and attention and consistency. And if you're listening to this and you're like, oh yeah, that sounds like me, you have to also ask yourself, if I could create consistency and discipline in this area with this thing, how would this transform my life? The rest of my life in other areas where I struggle to have that. Maybe it's exercise, like I said, maybe it's with how you look after yourself, maybe it is inside of meditation and all these other things. How would it shift your life if you could have the consistency and diligence and meticulousness of doing something every day, yeah, without fail, rain or shine, no matter how you feel? And that's the key. Sometimes you're not going to feel like doing it. You know, this morning I do a breath practice at the moment. I'm doing with a book called The Presence Process. And this morning I woke up and was like, I don't want to do this breath practice. I don't want to. I put it off for a little bit. I sat, I did it 15 minutes. Yeah. How you feel doesn't have to dictate the things you do. Some other things you have to focus on to remedy this is you have to do some emotional resilience work, because ultimately what's happening when your fear of not good enough coming up, you have the thoughts, but it's the emotions that the thoughts generate. So it's learning to be able to be with your thoughts, with your feelings, without allowing them to control you, without to be able to bring in some conscious thought. So emotional resilience work is like learning, you know, can be anything from like physical stuff. Certain types of breath work help us kind of become more resilient. Something else to remedy is more compassion. More self-compassion is really important, because in those moments when you start to berate yourself, self-compassion is a wonderful balm to create some space, but also remember that you're a human being. And you don't have to be angry with yourself, and you don't have to, you know, be angry with the world or whoever you're angry with, and you don't have to talk to yourself in this belittling and mean way. Getting out the head into the body, so like regular practices of movement. You know, breath work is one I really love. I love embodiment practices as well, which I bring into all of my programs to get you out of your head into your body, and you know, daily. You know, something daily that you do that's like about dropping you out of thought into the body, not like mindlessly, because I think a lot of exercise can be quite like mindlessly embodied, where you're kind of really thinking, but you're just doing the exercise. Like I see a lot of people in the gym now, and really they're not in the gym, they're on their phones. They're on their phones most of the time, and the weight lifting and pushing and running and stuff is a side thing, you know, it's a secondary thing. And I think I like to be in the gym and just kind of focus on what I'm doing with a level of presence. That's really important as well. Mindfulness, you know, there's so many benefits of mindfulness, but in this area, it's been incredible for me and my clients as well, like meditation, breath work, mindful walking, mindful eating, like being present, right? Because it gives you the capacity to, when you're having these thoughts, to put those thoughts to one side and come back to the moment. And that mechanism, again, I keep saying the word life-changing today, but it is life-changing. That mechanism is life-changing on its own. There is a plane flying outside of my window, so don't mind me. Accountability as well can be really useful. When we have a fear of not being good enough, we will avoid accountability, because if someone's holding us accountable, they may see us as not being good enough as well, right? But accountability, which can come through coaching, it can come through friendship, is really powerful, because part of the accountability I give my clients isn't just asking if they've done things or not done things and why they've not done it. It's also celebrating them when they have done the things that are really important to them. And that's something as men we can be so terrible at. If we do something wrong, we'll berate ourselves, or we see an issue, we'll berate ourselves. But when we actually do something right, we succeed, or we do something meaningful, we're very quick to just gloss over it as that's what I should be doing. And that's also part of what feeds into our fear of not being good enough. So compassionate accountability and supportive accountability is so important as well. And yeah, I think that's it. Having people around you who see you, who believe in you, support you, men's groups if you've got one, or friendship groups and so forth, partners and all sorts of things can be really useful in this capacity as well. But the most important thing is, and I've given you multiple practices you can do here. I've given you a number of practices here you can do, right? Is consistency is doing them. Listening to this podcast isn't going to change your fear of not being good enough. It's not. But if you don't do anything about it, then it will continue. If you don't do the work, you don't sit down and you do the right exercises, or you don't sit down and acknowledge your successes and wins, or even gratitude really works as well, right? But if you don't do it, it doesn't change. And it's not just you do it for a day or two and go, I still feel I'm not good enough. This fear has taken 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years to bed in. You're not going to solve it in 5 minutes. You're not going to solve it in half an hour, right? Or in a week. It's going to take consistent effort. But you just have to ask yourself, how would my life feel? How would my life be if this fear of not good enough wasn't there? Or it wasn't stopping me, at 80% of the things I do. And you have to ask, is that worth it? And I reckon you'd say yes. So it's worth 10, 20 minutes a day of practice of mindfulness and journaling practices that I've described. So it's really up to you. But if you don't do anything consistently, it won't change. So it's down to you. If you're interested in working on this sort of thing, I'm gonna have a program that comes out, and part of that program is going to be talking about a lot around the kind of inner critic, the fear of not being good enough, our struggles in relationships and dating and intimacy, as well as a whole host of ways in which we as men often struggle with moving away from the things we really desire, emotional work and so forth. And if you're interested in that, that's going to be starting up in August. But there's a wait list that's attached to the show notes, and if you're interested, add yourself to that, because that's where, if you're in the wait list, you can get huge discounts, basically, because I always do. Often offer men who, if you're not sure if you can afford it, you go on the wait list. It doesn't cost you anything, and all you'll get from me is an email to ask you if you're interested. And if you're not interested, you just say no, and I'm like, cool, thank you. And that's it. But, it's a win-win for you, really. But I will let you get on with the rest of your day and say ciao, ciao.